Today we're going to learn about the subjunctive, which is a new mood of the verb, and today we're really only going to focus on how do we form these forms. So what is the subjunctive? The subjunctive is a mood, and you know other moods, the indicative is also a mood, and it does exactly what you would think it does. It indicates or points to specific moments in time, actual facts. And we also know another mood, the infinitive, which you don't think of as a mood probably, but it is an incomplete mood, and that is how we can think about it. And we also know the imperative, right? That mood where we command people or order people around. And that's a bossy mood, I guess you could say. And so we do have these other moods that we know. The subjunctive is a mood that we're going to use for really specific purposes. Because unlike the indicative, which is about factual information, the subjunctive is not about factual information. It's about what your book calls hypothetical or doubtful or unreal situations. These are things that in English we usually indicate by words like would or might or could, may, right? Things like that where, well, it may rain, it might be cold, right? Where there's doubt or uncertainty. Those are situations where we tend to use the subjunctive in English, and those are also going to be situations where we use it in Latin, although we're not really going to talk about how we translate it right now, nor are we going to talk about the situations where we see it. We're going to begin with that next time. But it is usually in some kind of subordinate or dependent clause. Now, Latin has 4 tenses of the subjunctive, and we'll see soon why we need 4 tenses of the subjunctive. And of course, there are active forms and passive forms. But the thing to remember about these use of tenses is that we're going to see them in really specific situations that will become crystal clear, and we need them more for aspect, which we've talked about before with infinitives, than for actual tense. So it's really, these are going to tell us about a time relationship more than about an actual difference in translation. Okay? And so here are our 4 tenses. We have the present and the imperfect, the perfect and the pluperfect. So there are no future subjunctives because the subjunctive is, by its nature, uncertain, unreal, in the same way that the future is. So there's no future subjunctive, just present, imperfect, perfect, pluperfect. Now, one thing that I want to review before we look at how we form the present, the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect subjunctives is the endings that we use for really pretty much any verb. And you can see these endings here both in the active and the passive. MST, mustis und for the active, ristur, murmini untur for the passive. And these are the endings that we're going to be using for our subjunctive forms. So there's nothing new here. These are the same endings that you've been using to form, say, the future or the imperfect or whatever, right? Like these should be totally familiar to you. And what we're going to do is take these and then smush them onto slightly different verb forms, and that's going to give us our subjunctive form. For the present subjunctive, we use a little mnemonic device, and you can, I can give you some other options in class, but this one works. She wears a diamond. The thing that happens in the present subjunctive is we're just going to change the vowel that we normally use in the present tense. We change it to a different vowel or combination of vowels, and ta-da, we have the subjunctive. So instead of using an A in the first conjugation, we'll use an E. In the second, instead of an E, we use EA. In the third, instead of an E or an I, we use an A. And in the fourth, instead of an IE, we use an IA. And this is true for the third IO as well. So you can see, if you remember the sentence, she wears a diamond, and you know what verb what conjugation your verb belongs to, you will never go wrong. So you can see here, right, normally you would have amo, amas, amat, etc. And here, because we're in the first conjugation, we're going to have instead amem. We use the M for the subjunctive always, and then ames, it would be amet, right, etc. And you can see that this is how it's going to work for every conjugation. Instead of moneo, mones, we'll have moneam, moneas. Instead of dico, dicus, we have dicam, dicas with an A. And in the fourth, we have audiam, audias instead of audio, audi, audio, audis, right? So you can see what we're going to do is just use these vowels instead of the vowels we know. In the passive, it works exactly the same way. If you remember, for passive forms, we still use that present stem and we just add our passive endings. Here, what we're going to do is add those passive endings, but we are going to use the she wears a diamond vowels. And that's it. And you can just go on from there. So it is super, super easy. It's just like forming the present tense. We're just going to have a slightly different vowel. The present subjunctive of irregular verbs are obviously slightly irregular, and so I provide them for you here, especially because we're going to use forms of sum to form some of our other forms of the verbs, subjunctive forms of verbs. But you can see it's simsisit, simusitissint, so pretty straightforward. You can see possum is possim, possis, etc. It's just sum, but with that pos in the front. And then wolo, nolo, and malo have wellim, wellis, wellit, or nolim, nolis, nolit, or malim, malis, malit. You can see that they just have eyes all the way through, but they're totally consistent. So the difference with these 5 verbs is that we have eyes instead of she wears a diamond letters, but it's pretty straightforward. Notice that we still have that M in the first person singular, and then all of our other endings that would be totally expected. The imperfect subjunctive is very similar, except we're just going to use the present infinitive, active, and then we're going to add those same endings. So instead of something like mem, ames, we're going to have amarem, amares, right? So our second principal part, our present infinitive, is amare, and we just add the endings to that. And you can see that that's true for all of these forms. So we'll use it monere for the second, dicere for the third, audire for the fourth. And for third IO, right, capio would be capere, so it would be caperem, right? Just take that second principal part and add your endings to it. And just as we did for the present subjunctive passive, we're going to do the same thing in the passive. We're just going to take that same infinitive and add passive endings this time. So it is completely easy, completely regular. Aristur murminiuntur, we just add it on to our infinitive. And that's how you form the imperfect subjunctive. So the present and the imperfect subjunctive are really easy to form, where all we're doing is adding all those endings we know. For the present, we change a vowel. For the imperfect, we use the infinitive. For the perfect, it's slightly different because we're going to have sort of two different processes that we're going to use just as we do the same thing in the indicative, right? In the indicative, we use either the third principal part or we use the fourth principal part plus the verb to be in the passive. And we're going to do the same thing here for the perfect. We're going to take that third principal part and we're going to remove the I and add erim, eris, erit, etc. You will notice that except for this first person singular where we have erim, right, with the M, this is going to look identical to the future perfect. Okay, so you might think, oh, I'm going to be totally confused. I'm not going to know whether it's a perfect subjunctive or a future perfect. That's not going to happen. It's really clear when you have one or the other. We'll talk about that more later. But here you can see how it's formed. So we have amawi, right? If we took that, our third principal part, and we remove the I, that gives us amal, and then we just add erim, eris, erit. And we do that for any verb, right? So monoi becomes monuerem, monueris. Dixi becomes dixerim, dixeris. Audivi becomes audiverem, audiveris. Just like it happens when we do the future perfect. It's exactly the same, okay? Now, for the passive forms, we have the fourth principal part plus the subjunctive of the verb to be. And this is just like the perfect and passive indicative, if you think about it, where we have the fourth principal part and the present tense of essay. Here we have the present subjunctive of essay. So you can see it's amatus, amata, amatum, sim, amatus sis, amatus sit, right? Amatus simus, etc. And of course, the same would be for any verb. We would just take that fourth principal part, auditus, sim, auditus sit, sis, auditus sit, or we could use any verb that you like, really. The same will be true for deponent verbs, right? So we could say locutus sim, right, would be the perfect. They're all going to work exactly the same way. So instead of sum es est, we have sim sis sit. And that gives us our perfect passive forms. So super, super easy. We have the pluperfect subjunctive. For the pluperfect, we're going to take the perfect active infinitive, that is that form that ends in isse that we learned in the last chapter, and then we add our regular endings. This is for the active. So amawisem, amawises, amawiset, right, etc., etc. And it works the same for any verb. Audiwisem, audiwises, audiwiset. If we use dico, right, it's dixisse, and so it would be dixissem, dixisses, dixisses, set, right? So it is completely, completely regular. And for the passive, we're going to do what we did for the perfect. That is, we're going to use that fourth principal part, and then we'll add, instead of the present subjunctive, we'll add the imperfect subjunctive of esse. Remember the imperfect subjunctive, we use the present infinitive plus mst, mustis und. And so we would have amatus essem, amata esses, auditus essem, auditum esses, right, etc. So these are completely, completely regular. I realize that this is a lot of forms to throw at you because you now have 4 new tenses of the subjunctive, active and passive forms. But the good thing is that we still use our MST, mustis und, are restur more mini untur, and we're just learning to add them onto new stems, or we're just changing vowels. But the process and really what we're doing is exactly the same, and it really is more or less logical if we compare it to the tenses we already know. So finally, to sum up, the things that are most important to know here, I think, are that the subjunctive is a mood that we're going to use for hypothetical or doubtful situations. And we don't know what those are yet, but we'll learn them soon. And usually we're going to see them in dependent clauses, and we'll learn more about that in the weeks ahead. Latin has 4 tenses of the subjunctive that we're going to be playing with and learning. And they're formed from all of our regular principal parts that we know. Present subjunctives are formed from the present stem, from that first principal part. Imperfect subjunctives are also formed from the present stem, from the second principal part. Perfect subjunctives are formed from the third and fourth principal parts, as are the pluperfect subjunctives, which is exactly the same as perfect and pluperfect indicatives. So we're using the same parts for the same jobs. And our subjunctives use our regular old endings, so there's nothing new there and no surprises. Okay? If you want to see lists of all of these forms written out in excruciating detail, you can find them in chapter 22 of your book. You can also find them in the back of your book. And I will post a handout on Moodle where you can also see them sort of all together in a way that I hope makes sense and makes it logical for you. But really, they follow really regular patterns, and there's nothing really new here, nothing that you don't already know. We're just going to be manipulating different forms. So for homework, please try the exercise on page 270, where at the very top, where you're just going to be taking a present subjunctive and you're going to turn it into the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect. So if you have something like decot, then you need to do the third person singular active forms. So you'll just have 3 more forms to do for each of those verbs. Try them out, see how you do. Try to do them without checking, and then check your work periodically to see how you're doing. Okay.